So we're going to start the way we normally do with page 73 of the prayer book, reciting the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha. That is this first verse 3 times in English. And then after we do that, we'll go forward and do just a couple more prayers. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Go forward to page 97 or 98, depending on where the short mandala offering prayer is in your prayer book. You have 2 different versions. So just this first verse that starts with this ground, we'll recite that in English, and then we'll skip to the mantra, offering mantra Idam Guru on page 98, and then we'll do Refuge in Bodhicitta on page 98, once in English, twice in the Tibetan. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam La Jangchu Bardu Dakni Kyab Suchi Daki Chunyan Gi Peso Nam Gi Dola Panchir Sangye Druparsho Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam La Jangchu Bardu Dakni Kyab Suchi Daki Chunyan Gi Peso Nam Gi Dola Panchir Sangye Druparsho. Okay, let's do a short meditation before we begin the class. Give ourselves a chance to focus the mind a bit and to generate a good motivation. So the first few minutes, we'll just do meditation on the breath, using the breath as an object of focus, trying to increase our mindfulness, our attention, concentration. So if you have a technique that you already use with the breath, you can do that for the next few minutes. If not, then I usually suggest working with this point at the tip of the nose, where you feel the sensation of the air coming in and out of the nostrils. Making that your focal point, just stay present with that sensation. And in any meditation on the breath, we want to be checking in through the force of what we call our introspection, this part of our mind where we kind of spy, check occasionally, see what's going on with the quality of our meditation. And if when we check in, we find that we're with the breath, then that's fine. We just check back out again. Then if we check in and we see that we've lost the breath, then we have to correct our meditation, which means we have to renew our focus on the breath, let go of whatever it was that was distracting us, if it was thoughts or sounds, whatever it was that pulled us away. So I'll ring the chime. We'll do this in silence for just a few minutes, and then I'll lead you in a short reflection to adjust our motivation for being here tonight. So now let's take a few moments to adjust our motivation to this ideal mind of bodhicitta. So again, we all have the potential to achieve Buddhahood. This is the concept that we call Buddha nature, which is simply the fact that each and every single sentient being has a mind that is in its very essence pure, clear. And what we're looking at currently in this text, all of these afflicted states, they're in the mind only adventitiously. They're not in the nature of our minds. They're not hardwired into our minds. They're not inherent to our minds. Yes, we have had these afflictions since beginningless time, but that's simply because we have not yet addressed them. We haven't created the causes to remove them. So we're doing this study so we can learn how to accomplish this goal, to develop our minds to that degree by weakening and eventually eliminating all of these negative states, these afflictions, enhancing and developing all the positive qualities, the virtuous states. And in this way, each of us can attain that state of Buddhahood. simply because we possess a mind that has that nature. So when we cultivate bodhicitta, we do it within that understanding that, first of all, I myself, each of us, has this potential to achieve that state. So we are making that strong intention to accomplish Buddhahood ourselves. But we're doing that within the context of being able to help all sentient beings to do the same work. They are the main goal of this mind of bodhicitta. Moistened by the minds of compassion and loving kindness, we want to attain the state of Buddhahood so we can accomplish that for the sake of these beings. So they're the main objective. They're who we want to ideally help. But we have to help ourselves first to be able to do that. We have to become enlightened, achieve our potential as Buddhas to help others to do the same. So as we undertake this study again tonight, try to develop this mind of bodhicitta very deeply in your heart so that all of this examination of our own minds, our own afflictions will lead to our attainment of Buddhahood. So we then can skillfully guide every single sentient being to that same state. Okay, so we are working our way through these 51 mental factors. Again, these mental factors are sort of a way of conceptually isolating all the various things that are going on in our minds. And so we're working with the 6 groups of these, and the one group that we're in particular is what are called the secondary afflictions. We went through all of the root afflictions. We're, in the text, we're on page 71. The secondary afflictions began on page 68. There's 20 of these. And before well, actually, first let me go ahead and distribute here if there's anybody who didn't get a copy of this last time when we started our study of the secondary afflictions. This is kind of a summary of them that shows where they all are derived from. Recall that of the 6 root afflictions, there are 3 that are primary. They are attachment, anger, and ignorance. So let me put this on the screen just for a moment before we continue. Those at home may already have this, but since I did send it out to folks, but this on the screen now are the secondary afflictions all listed with, in parentheses, where they derive from. So the first 5 that we looked at last week, most of those came from anger. They are minds that are essentially about a disturbed state where we are looking at something that we are not enjoying and we are making up all this story around it. Belligerence being a very violent, aggressive story. Resentment being one where we are being very vengeful. Spite having that kind of very, again, pointed negativity towards another. And then jealousy, where we're upset at what others possess. Again, envy is probably a more appropriate word than jealousy. We discussed that last week. But this is where we get upset at the good things that others have. The one I want to touch on briefly is, before we continue, is concealment, because we did talk about concealment. It derives from ignorance, and as we'll see as we go through, continue our survey of these 20 secondary afflictions, each of them come from one or more of these 3 root delusions, and we'll go into that in more detail. Well, let me stop the share for those who are online and just read a little bit from, I just want to make sure we're clear about what concealment is. There was a little bit of confusion about it, and I may have even said things that are not maybe completely in line with the more traditional way of talking about this. It's important to distinguish this from one we're going to probably look at tonight, which is called dissimulation, which is the idea of where we sort of present an appearance to others of hiding our faults, but it's primarily out of an attachment to gain, honor, what have you. Here with concealment, the idea, again, if we go back to that page 70, we saw that concealment was a hiding of misdeeds when one is justly, rightly accused and is involved with ignorance. So this is where somebody will come to us, and maybe even a spiritual guide, and with no ill intent points out our faults. And we conceal them, we don't reveal them. And again, there can be, I guess, some level of ignorance of whether they were faults or not. But I think in most cases, we have some understanding that there are faults. And there was some wording in this that was even a little strange. It says there it has the function of acting as a support for not abiding in contact with regret. But other translations actually say that it causes regret. We even saw that in, I think, Geshe Rabtin's slide when we looked at that. So we need to know what is going on here. Well, regret is one of those factors we haven't looked at yet. It's in the 4 changeable, which are the very last category of the 6. We're going to get to those after we go through all of these secondary afflictions. And regret has both connotations to it. It's changeable. If we are regretting something that was very negative, that's what we normally talk about in our purification, right? Where we bring to mind the ways that we've, through our speech, through our physical actions, even through our thoughts, where we've done things that are not good for ourselves and good for others, we generate a regret that regrets those negative things. But you can regret positive things too, right? You can regret that you did something really good. You can regret that you were very kind or generous to someone else because you're based on the way they behaved after that. You might have regrets. Even though you were bending over backwards to be kind to them, they didn't even say thank you or something. And so you might have these regrets at having done something virtuous. So regret does have a sort of changeable nature. And we can, of course, have a lot of other flavors of regret where we simply regret the things that we've done, regret that we've held on to some negativities and what have you, but that may not be coming immediately. I mean, at the point of concealment, it seems that you are concealing something. And I agree with this way it's worded here. It doesn't allow you to come into contact with a healthy regret that would allow you to move forward and purify it, but it does cause some internal regret because you will live with that reality that you concealed your faults to this person who was rightly pointing them out to you. So I do want to read this. This is from a little book called The Inner Science of Buddhist Practice. It's a translation of this text that we've seen reference to occasionally, Vasubandhu's Summary of the 5 Heaps, translated by Artemis Engel. And they have a very strange name for concealment in here. They call it dissembling. Dissembling is closer to pretension and deceit, I think, than it is to concealment. But nonetheless, there are some things that are worth talking about in the way it's described, regardless of what word is being used. So Artemis Engel uses dissembling. We were using concealment. He says it's a form of ignorance in which you conceal objectionable acts that you committed. For instance, when someone who wishes to be helpful and is not motivated by such attitudes as desire, hatred, or fear, asks at an appropriate time, "Did you do this?" Dissembling is a form of ignorance because it is a mental state that takes the form of concealing objectionable acts. So at that time when someone would say, did you steal that money? And you would be like, no, you don't reveal it. Instead you conceal that. Well then, this is, again, it's very close to what we would call our dissimulation, where we're sort of hiding our faults. But in this case, it's more out of a sort of an ignorance that holds on to this state of thinking that it's better, I guess, for us to not reveal those. That somehow we're going to maybe lose face, or it's not as attached to, again, gain and honor as what we will see with dissimulation. But nonetheless, it does cause us to kind of keep things to ourselves. Here we don't sort of make professions maybe outright that we didn't do things, but we certainly don't reveal them. It says here, its action is to provide support for regret. I found that kind of interesting again. And for remaining in a discontented state. So the idea here is that you remain in this sort of place of you didn't reveal what it was that you were asked. You weren't forthright in revealing those faults, and therefore you have to live with that kind of regret. So it says here, it is natural that someone who conceals his or her misdeeds will give rise to regret, and because regret unavoidably causes mental distress, the person who engages in this dissembling or concealment will remain in a discontented state. So that interpretation that Geshe Rabten had, and that is in this one as well, that it is a source of regret, means that because you concealed those things at that time, you have to live with that regret of not having been, again, revelatory, not having been forthright in admitting to those things. So again, it is somewhat close to what we're going to see with this pair that we're going to look at tonight that are called pretension or deceit and dissimulation, which in one case you are professing to have things that you don't have, qualities you don't possess. And the other one, you're hiding the false negative qualities that you do possess. But nonetheless, it's got a slightly different flavor to it. Maybe again, because of the particular situation that is being spelled out here of someone who is with good intention pointing out your faults to you, or trying to help you in that process, and you're not willing to step up and say, yes, I did that. So I don't know. I mean, last week I was talking a little bit more about how it could be coming from a place of ignorance, of not even believing that what you did was wrong. I think that's still possible. But nonetheless, I think we have to extend the definition a little to include this type of idea, that we might simply be, again, not willing to, for whatever reason, reveal that. So it's a mind that is clinging to that kind of concealing. In this way, again, how is it related to ignorance? I think simply because, again, we're not at that time fully aware and knowing what is the proper thing to do. It's kind of keeping us in a state of misunderstanding what is the right thing to do at that time, what's the more appropriate thing to do in concealment, or in revealing it, rather than going to concealment. So I don't know, that's the best I can explain it. I looked at a number of other commentaries, and this was the only one I found that kind of went into a little bit more description about this relationship to regret and how concealment can be a source of regret. Any comments on that, or from people online? Yeah, Amy. Sure.
I was with a group here, practice group for a while, and there was some insurance billing stuff. Everybody knew what they were doing. It was just a matter of believing whether or not it was okay to do it or not. Like maybe billing things that weren't entirely accurate, getting reimbursed for things that maybe weren't actually done.
So it was more of a hesitation you're talking about, Amy?
I mean, it was more of, some people believed it was wrong to do that, some people believed it was fine to do that.
So it was a not knowing which was the correct one.
But everybody knew what they were doing. It wasn't a matter of is this occurring? It was a matter of, well, this is fine, and no, this is not fine. Would that be what we're talking about? Or more, if you didn't know that you were doing it to begin with?
So I don't know. Amy's bringing out a situation she was in where, it had to do with some insurance billings, and some people doing that thinking they were doing it rightly, and that it was
okay because they have plenty of money and it doesn't matter, and it's only $8 or whatever, and other people saying, well, no, because that wasn't actually the service that was provided. That's not okay. But I really believe some of these people believe it's okay.
That it's ethical. They're saying it's unethical, but it's okay to act unethically towards this person.
I'm not
or
sure.
Entity, because they have a lot of money. So
I'm not
steal money from them, so it doesn't matter.
I mean,
I've heard that a lot.
Yeah.
But I mean, but there wasn't any. Everybody knew what was. It wasn't any no. Everybody knew what was happening. It was just a position on what was happening.
Okay. So Amy's situation is one where everybody knew what was happening, you're saying, but not everybody was clear about what the properness of what was happening. Yes. In other words, whether it was correct or not. Morally, ethically, yeah. Well, again, I think in this case, if for it to be concealment, we have to be dealing with something that is a fault, that is something wrong that maybe we don't necessarily know the full ramification of, but we have some idea that it's something we shouldn't be engaging in. Otherwise, the concealment wouldn't be non-virtuous. It's got to have it, because it's one of the secondary afflictions. All these secondary afflictions have a non-virtuous nature, meaning that they are in that vein of producing a negative karma because they're coming from that place of ignorance and so on, all the various delusions. So in that way, I don't know if it can be coming from a pure not knowing. I think in some level we have to have some understanding that it's wrong, or some idea that it's wrong. Again, I was talking last week about how we might even have an overlooking of it. I think there are some times where people, and this is maybe going away from the example that you're using, but I think sometimes when people come to Buddhist teachings and they hear all this about the 10 non-virtues and stuff, they say, oh, well, that can't possibly be right, because I'm sure that's culturally bound or something. That's not something that I need to pay attention to. And so they make their own decision about what to do with that particular precept that is taught by the Buddha, and think that they're going to trust in that kind of assessment. And so in that way, when somebody speaks to this, like if a teacher were to ask them, a spiritual guide were to ask that person, they would feel that there's no purpose in revealing it, because it's not in their mind a misdeed. Now, is it a misdeed or not? Well, again, this is how it's taught by the Buddha. I don't know. These things get quite complex when you start getting into the intricacies of it. Because I would think, again, that in the case of concealment, the reason why it becomes non-virtuous is because it is a wrong. It is something that you know is wrong, something that you have some conviction in is wrong. But nonetheless, if you decide, in the way I was just talking about, that something that the Buddha said isn't wrong, that doesn't make it right, necessarily. There's got to be something more behind it than that, and than just a sort of an assessment. So it gets to be very tricky, because there are what we call natural misdeeds, things that are done that will have a non-virtuous flavor to them, because they're natural misdeeds. These are things like killing and stealing and so on. We can do them with a positive motivation in certain situations. But in those situations, again, the karma gets a little bit more complex, because it still has the flavor of the natural misdeed, but then it has the positive motivation. And so you end up with these kinds of interplays of different types of karma. But nonetheless, going back to the concealment thing, it's very hard for me to say what that would be in the case of the specific example that you're talking about. I don't know. What are your thoughts on it?
I mean, my thought was just like, are you guys crazy? That's stealing. That's not cool. So I feel like
I mean, if
they weren't
that's
necessarily concealing it, but I'm sure if the IRS or the insurance company had asked it, I shouldn't say I'm sure, but I believe they would have concealed it, because they would. It's a crime, you get in trouble for that. Like, they take you to jail, and they pull your license. But that doesn't mean they believe it's wrong.
right.
It just means they know that it's against the rules, which I think there are rules that are
Unethical.
rules that I break, because I think the rules are wrong.
So this is where, again, what Amy's been talking about is essentially, you do get into kind of these intricacies of rules versus what is real bottom line ethical behavior, which is, of course, described in Buddhist texts in terms of motivation and action and so on. So all of these various details. So I don't know, concealment gets to be a little more complex, because we do have to have something that is being concealed that is a fault. Right there in the definition, it says it is a hiding of misdeeds when one is justly accused and is involved with ignorance. So it has to be a misdeed. Now, again, when we subscribe to a particular profession and it has rules of conduct or ways of behaving in that profession that may not be unethical according to Buddhist teachings, but would be unethical in terms of that profession or whatever the codes of conduct are for that discipline, then maybe we do have to do a deeper investigation. We are trying to be forthright and comply with these rules in society and what have you in terms of different professions. So maybe they are to be upheld. But nonetheless, we wouldn't want to do something that is going against our bottom line ethics, certainly. If it's not upsetting that, then I don't know that it's necessarily as serious. It becomes more of a code of conduct that particular profession wants to engage in. But certainly things that, like I said, like stealing, those sorts of, or lying, these sorts of things. Yeah. Yeah. So if those things are involved, then they're misdeeds in Buddhism as well, and we wouldn't want to be participating in them. Yeah. So again, the concealment would be, to, first of all, if we avoid the misdeed in the first place, you don't have to worry about concealment, right? Because you're never doing the misdeed in the first place. But when the misdeed comes to our attention, then we have to be willing to admit to that, to reveal that, and not, again, in the context of what was talked about here, it was somebody who's benignly pointing out your faults. It's not somebody who's doing it in a different vein, but I don't know if it always has to be that way. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of commentary when it gets down into the nitty-gritty of a lot of these, so we have to kind of fill in the blanks. But I hope there's some understanding then of what we mean by this mind of concealment, because it is a negative state of mind. It's where we're not willing to profess to these things. And in that way, we're never willing to go further beyond that, and so there is some regret that we've held back. We haven't really, again, been forthright and honest. All right. Any other comments on that or on any of these that we've looked at so far? All right, let's continue. We're going to work with the text first, and go through the next one, which is miserliness. Miserliness, of course, comes from attachment. It's got that same flavor to it of being very attached, grasping at the things that we possess and so on. It says regarding miserliness, page 71, the Compendium of Knowledge says, what is miserliness? It is a thorough holding of the mind to possessions due to excessive attachment to gain and honor, and is involved with attachment. It has the function of acting as a support for the non-diminishment of possessions. So, again, this is this tight, as it says, it's a tight holding that is unable to let go of possessions. Possessions can be of a variety of types. It doesn't have to be just physical possessions. Through the force of attachment to gain and honor. So gain and honor are very much involved in this. A lot of times this is put out as like the what qualifies some of these things in terms of when they become quite non-virtuous is because of that attachment. You know, we might, you know, hold on to resources out of wisdom, for example. Maybe somebody is asking for resources from us that we know will be put to bad use. You know, they'll use them to harm other people or something. Well, then that wouldn't be miserliness because it's not out of our attachment to gain and honor. Instead, it's coming out of a more virtuous mind. But in terms of this secondary affliction, it's always arising from some grasping, holding on to what we have, not wanting to part from it. It produces serious, undesirable consequences in both this life and future lives. So it really has a lot to do with, as it says, they're kind of the possessions that we have. Recalling that in the teachings on karma, one of the main ones that emphasizes the idea that we gain resources, we have resources in our life through our practice of generosity, through our not being miserly. So if we live our whole lives miserly and always holding on to everything, we may think that it keeps all of our possessions quite secure and in place for our use. But when we leave this life, we've created the causes only to not have resources because we've never been generous with our resources. We haven't created that type of karma. So again, this is why it can produce great suffering in this life and in future lives. And that karma can even ripen in this life in terms of having a diminishment of our resources on the basis of our miserliness. But certainly in future lives, we won't have the resources that we have been enjoying because we haven't created the karma to have that. I had teachings from one teacher early on in my Dharma career that said if we got this principle of the karma of generosity really at a deep level, we'd give everything away instantly because we'd know that, just have a complete trust that everything would be taken care of. We're creating that type of karma that is extending it outward, that it will take care of itself. The karma will be there. But it's kind of scary to get to that place of like, oh, I'm going to give it all away. I don't know how many people get to that place. Pardon? Time lapse involved. This is the thing. I mean, it's not like you get the check in the mail the day that you send the check out. Oh yeah, that I talked about. I think it's good that we have that kind of karma of a willingness. If we can't give it all away, when we receive something, to always give at least a part of it away, to always have that kind of idea that, oh, why should I take all this and put this all in my own bank account and enjoy it? You know, let me at least use a portion of this to create that type of karma. And then we work our way towards that. I mean, I don't know if you can get to this example I was mentioning was a nun who worked for Venerable Rabina up in the office in Taos, Venerable Kathy. And she used to, Patrick would sometimes, my partner worked in the office, and he would sometimes give her money because he always felt sorry for her. She never seemed like to have any resources, but that was because she was always giving them. So he would like give her $20 and she'd like immediately say, oh good, I can get some books for the prisoners with this, you know. And so there was just this kind of, she was just a conduit to get the money where it needed to go and didn't really worry about what she had in the bank account or what she needed to take care of herself. So Losang Kathy, I think, is Venerable Losang Kathy. You knew her as well, Rachel, yeah. All right, let's continue on the top of page 72, where we have this little verse from the Moon Lamp Sutra. It says, let's read this together. This body which is rotting away, as well as one's life force, waver helplessly. The childish are attached to dreamlike illusions, thus committing extremely evil actions. They come under the power of misdeeds. The unwise depart, mounted on the Lord of Death, and proceed to hell with unendurable minds. Kind of heavy duty there. a bit of like Buddhist fire and brimstone. So the idea behind this, though, is that, again, karmically, if this is what we do with our lives, and there are people, unfortunately, who have those patterns, get very deeply ingrained in kind of being very attached to what is, as it says, they're dreamlike illusions. I mean, all of this is sort of illusory. It's just here, not with any sort of substantial nature, as we discussed in terms of the emptiness teachings, but it's all sort of just passing as well, even just its impermanence. You can't take it all with you. You don't, empty your bank account into your pockets when you leave this life and carry it on to the next life. It's all just left behind. So in this way, if all we've done is like hold on to all of this while our body's just rotting away, our life force is ending, and then, through our misdeeds, we've departed from this life not having done anything of great merit, well then inevitably we will end up in one of these unfortunate states. Maybe not the hell state, but certainly, something that will not be as fortunate as what we currently possess. Again, in this weekend's retreat, we're going to look at this idea of this human rebirth that we possess currently that came about through many causes and conditions, and we need to be attentive to those. Not wasting this life, not even creating the causes for another good rebirth like this one, at least to gain that. So then there's another quote from Yanagarbha's Dharanis that accomplish infinite doors. Infinite doors. Interesting phrase. Let's read this together. Sentient beings who get into a fight hold tightly to the basis of the quarrel. Thus, if they were to abandon that for which they have craving, and also abandon craving, they will attain a Dharani. So Dharani are like these very special skills that can be developed. One that we studied or saw in our studies in the master's program was the Dharani of retention, where you are able to retain everything that you hear verbatim. You become like a recorder. You can recall all of this through retaining the words and the meanings of the words and what have you. But these Dharanis are great accomplishments. So, instead of holding on to everything with such a tight mind, if we're able to abandon that for which they have craving, let go of all of our craving, our grasping, our strong adherence to all the things of this life and so on, we'll attain these Dharanis, we'll attain these great states and continue beyond that even to the deeper accomplishments, and so on. And it says there are infinite such teachings. So again, what they've cited in these verses, what Yeshe Geltzen, our author, has cited, are speaking to that. But if we've studied karma, when we have this, hopefully some level of conviction that this is how things work, and we can't neglect that. If we go back to the 6 perfections of a bodhisattva, which are how we attain enlightenment, the very first one, which is said to be the simplest to practice, is generosity. And so the mind of generosity is directly opposed to miserliness. And we have to start where we are in kind of being comfortable with what giving we're doing, but always try to push it a little further, try to be as generous as we can. And recall that generosity is not just money. There is the generosity of material things, of course, but then there's also the generosity of giving protection from fear, which is something we can all do. Even just, it was interesting, Alex Berzin in one of his teachings said, even just our living our lives in a nonviolent way, where the people that we meet in the street, that's giving that type of protection from fear. No one has anything to fear from us. We're going about our lives in a non-harmful way. So that's one way that we can practice, all of us, in being kind to others and that type of generosity, giving them that fearlessness. Then the last one, of course, is the giving of the Dharma. These are the 3 that are traditionally taught. And by the Dharma, we don't mean you have to be sitting in a formal position as a Dharma teacher giving the Dharma. You can do that for the people in your lives to the extent that you are able to and feel skillful enough to do. Then by all means, share these teachings with them. But again, that may be something that we have to work up to some degree. But that's said to be the greatest way to give, is to give the Dharma to others. And then the one that's taught in the, I think it's Guhya Samaja Tantra, is giving love, which means just having that mind of loving kindness towards everyone. We made a bit of what I was discussing earlier in terms of a non-harmfulness. But this is even more that exuberance of like loving kindness towards the beings in our lives, whoever we approach or meet. So There's a question from folks at home. Dharani's also synonymous with realizations. I would say a dharani is a type of realization that's attained oftentimes through concentration or other accomplishments. I don't know technically what the definition of a dharani is. I don't know if, Rachel, if you've got a recollection from your studies too.
It's funny because I keep thinking it's this magical phrase. Because I think they call there's a type of mantra that's a dharani.
Yeah.
So, but it's in this context, it's more like a skill.
Mm.
So I haven't investigated
Yeah.
that anymore,
Maybe.
I do remember it more on the line of being like a mantra or a,
Yeah, they often have the dharani of da 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 da, and it's something you recite. So in that context, it becomes more like a.
but I don't know if that's like the dharani of Chenrezig is the mantra of compassion.
Yeah.
Like, because there's this skill that goes along with
Yeah, I
the
don't know.
mantra. I don't know, maybe.
So so it's Rachel was just saying, it's in this context, it seems like it's more of a skill. Now, whether it's realization, I mean, realizations are of many different types. So we would say, in my estimation, probably it would be included in realizations, but not every realization is a dharani. So, but maybe I'll.
Saying that it's a mnemonic device which encapsulates the meaning
Yeah.
of a section or a chapter.
Okay, so that's where it can be more of a phrase. But in here, when it says they will attain a dharani, I think they mean that there's something more to it beyond that. Maybe.
If you attain the
Then you gain that.
the mantra,
Yeah.
the synopsis of that sutra.
You gain that realization.
Realization of that.
Yeah.
You gain that.
Yeah. Anyway, so Alex, just so for those at home, Alex looked it up on online and found that it was the mnemonic. Mnemonic. Sorry, there's all those M's and N's in there. Mnemonic device that is used, that it kind of encapsulates a sutra and kind of the meaning of that sutra, or we could say again of a particular being or Buddha, what have you. But so again, if we do achieve that dharani, attain that dharani, then that means that again we kind of have gained the full realization of that sutra or that Buddha of compassion or whatever it is that has the dharani. Sorry, that's the best answer I can give. We'll maybe take a look at it next week or in a few weeks. Next week, by the way, while I'm, before I forget to announce, we will have discussion here. Rachel will be leading it because I will be away. And so please join us for that. And if the folks at home want to join for discussion, maybe Rachel can set up the Zoom with them as well, because we have it in the schedule. So it's just, tuning into that and you can join from afar. So let's go to sharing the slides. You've already got them here in the Gompa, but I want to do the share for the folks at home so we can look at Geshe Rabtin's book. I've been doing this pretty regularly, showing the passages from Geshe Rabtin, this book called Mind and Its Functions that was published a number of years ago. And again, the translation equivalents for some of these terms are a little different. In the case of miserliness, Stephen Batchelor, who did the translation, called it avarice. He said, avarice is a mental factor that, out of attachment to respect and material gain, firmly holds on to one's possessions with no wish to give them away. It has the function of cherishing one's possessions without letting them decrease. So it kind of doesn't cause you to have any diminishment in your resources because you're holding on to them. But of course, you're not increasing the causes to have them in the future. So you, and again, your desire is to hold on to them, but that's not always the result that you get. As it was said, it can cause even suffering in this lifetime, much less future lifetimes. The next slide, it says this mental factor causes us pain whenever the possibility arises of being separated from what we own and regard as dear to us. In addition to occurring with regard to material objects, it can also develop with regard to our inner understanding of Dharma. So that's why one of our acts of generosity is giving the Dharma. Well, we might, through some delusion, holding on to our knowledge of the Dharma. If someone is new and studying something and they ask us questions about it and we don't want them to have our knowledge. I mean, it sounds very strange. Sounds like it goes completely against the grain of our bodhicitta motivation, because we should be happily, freely giving knowledge. They even say that many of these great teachers, they wanted nothing more than their students, their disciples, to excel them in knowledge. So they were always happy to give them the knowledge, knowing that it would be put to good use and what have you. So again, we can't hold back on the Dharma. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't have we need to be very discriminating in how we use the Dharma with others. And if we have somebody who is exhibiting that they really want it just so they can ridicule it or make fun of it or do something that would be negative to it, well, then in those cases, we might make a different decision. But that's not coming out of miserliness again. In this case, we're talking about a miserliness that wants to hold on to our inner understanding of the Dharma, not share that with others. You've got a quizzical look on your face, Rachel.
I'm reading into it. Just in terms of, not just in terms of giving it, in terms of being generous with teaching the Dharma or delivering the Dharma, but in I'm looking at it in terms of, well, how does my choice of how I act or do certain things maybe develop or not develop my inner understanding of Dharma.
Okay, yeah.
I don't know. Like I said, maybe I'm reading.
Yeah, I guess we have to go back to, is that miserliness or not? So Rachel was just bringing up, again, that if we read into this idea of our inner understanding of Dharma, which is on the slide from Geshe Rabten, is this also those ways that the things that we do and choose to do that maybe don't allow that to be deepened and developed? Right.
Whatever.
Yeah. I guess we have to look at it from the point of view of, again, miserliness would mean our desire to not share, to not. So I think that may be, it's certainly non-virtuous, but
this idea of spiritual materialism, right? This kind of grasping at, I want this kind of gain or honor. I have this, I want to keep that, right? And that kind of collecting of spiritual experience, that's not really inner understanding of Dharma. It's a spiritual material.
Yeah, an acquisition in that way. So Rachel was just pointing out again this idea of spiritual materialism that Chogyam Trungpa coined this term, but the idea being that, we can kind of make the Dharma into something that becomes a source of more attachment and acquisition, wanting to have. Again, but I would still, in terms of it becoming miserliness, I think it has to be where we also are unwilling to share that but maybe the holding tight to it. And when you look at the pure description of it, it simply says it's the thorough holding of the mind to possessions due to excessive attachment to gain and honor. So I don't know, maybe it could qualify. I think again, not to say that that's certainly non-virtuous. We're not arguing that part of it. And so I think we have to kind of extend any of these that we encounter, our understanding to what does it mean in terms of our own practice and our own behavior. These are worthwhile exploring and applying in this case. We've got a couple more slides from Geshe Rabten. The next one, it says, "It is thus the greatest obstacle to giving away our possessions to and sharing our understanding with others. In the future, it is a cause for both material and spiritual poverty." So again, if we have that grasping, holding mind, aren't willing to share, well, then we're only creating the causes to be bereft of it in the future, because you're not circulating it. You're not keeping it moving around. So,
I find it interesting, like spiritual things that you're giving away, or like you're giving away. We all have encountered some people. For me, it's been mostly Catholic, but not Catholic, Christian faith, in which people want to convert me. They think they're being very generous by going to another community and wanting to take over the community and save these people.
Right.
And so I think it's interesting how we address the spirituality of giving spirituality.
Okay. Yeah.
Someone once said, but when you give a baby food, you let them spit it out. If they want to spit it out, you don't force them to do it.
So Alex was just bringing up how in her experience from some of the other traditions, Christian traditions in particular, the idea of kind of what a generosity of spirituality looks like in terms of wanting to convert you or get you to accept their particular point of view out of, again, driven perhaps by some good motivation, like some compassion, some desire for us not to suffer, but nonetheless a bit misguided in terms of, it's like the example you said of shoving the food down the baby's mouth and not letting the baby spit it out. We always have that option. And I guess, again, the other thing that in Buddhism, in my experience at least, is that we don't really offer the food to those who don't ask for the food either, in a sense. It doesn't mean that we can't find other ways of offering points of view and what have you. But that's why I always encourage people, whatever your role is, if you want to share some Buddhist wisdom knowledge that you think is appropriate for others, to even ask permission, to say, well, I've studied some Buddhism and I have some ideas about how you might look at that, but is that something you'd like to hear? I don't know, I just think it's just a kinder way of going about it, and it allows there to be some receptivity. If the person says, no, I really don't want to hear any Buddhist stuff, and you're like, okay, well then that's fine, I won't share it with you. Then it kind of don't create any of that negative karma either way. You just kind of let it go. And so I don't know, that's kind of a better approach in my mind, but hopefully we can still see the good motivation of these people. I remember one time in Pasadena, His Holiness was teaching, and when we came out of the teachings, there were all of these people with their banners on the other side of the street, about burning in hellfire and da-da-da-da and all this. And some of the people coming out of the teaching were going over there and confronting them. And it just felt like the wrong thing in my mind to do. I tried to see them through this lens of like, well, they've got good intention. They wouldn't be there spending their free day holding these signs if they didn't in some way have some concern for our suffering. Misguided, but nonetheless, it's at the very root of it, there's something good there. And so I just tried to rejoice in that. You don't want to get too caught up in all the other verbiage and the ways they're putting their message out and what have you. But just try to be a little bit more in touch with what it was that was driving them to do that. Now, again, that might be delusion driving them to do that too. I don't know what's driving them to do that. I don't have that knowledge, but I can still think in those terms and try to frame it in that context. And then it doesn't cause me to get angry at them. But yeah, it is a curious thing in terms of what spiritual giving looks like in different traditions. The last little slide on this from Geshe Rabden, there are two kinds of avarice or miserliness: the intention to never give something away and the intention to not give something away for the time being. So it's kind of interesting. I don't know. I'd never heard this division before, and it isn't in our text, but the idea that there's a temporal kind of component to it, those things that seem to be more of a determination that I'm never going to give this away. I don't care what your needs are or what you're doing, or the intention just simply not being there yet, not going to give it away for the time being due to whatever other factors. It's an interesting division. Like I said, I don't know what it really means when it comes down to it, but any other comments then on these slides, or stop the share and go back to... All right. So that was the first of these for tonight that we're looking at, number 6 in our list. Let's go on to this pair that we're going to look at now that I mentioned previously, deceit and dissimulation, number 7 and 8. And these both are arising from a combination of attachment and ignorance, or from one or the other. It does seem in some presentations that they say you have the deceit that comes from attachment and the deceit that comes from ignorance, and the same for dissimulation, but nonetheless, we can also see how they can be playing a role together. Other words for deceit, some translations will have pretension, deception, even hypocrisy. So regarding deceit, on page 72, it says, what is deceit? It is a display of what is not one's good quality due to excessive attachment to gain and honor, and is involved with attachment and ignorance. It has the function of acting as a support for wrong livelihood. So this is where we are pretending. That's where this word pretension is related to pretend. It's you are putting on airs. You're professing to have qualities that you don't in fact possess. So you're deceiving others through that. You're not giving them an accurate portrayal of who you are. And you can be doing this in a variety of ways. It doesn't have to just be through the things that you're saying. It can be the way that you your body language, the way that you communicate with others, the things that you put on that make people think. Of course, it becomes a huge obstacle and a huge problem in terms of our spirituality, because we don't want to put on those kinds of airs and be hypocritical, professing to be such great practitioners or what have you, when in fact, our practice is really quite weak. These sorts of things are where deceit becomes, and once more, recall that this whole presentation of these 51 mental factors is primarily to highlight those things that are involved in our spiritual practice, that are either obstacles to furthering it or are things that are a great boon to our spiritual practice. So in that way, deceit is even presented, as we'll see, involved in that. But the main way that deceit gets presented in the traditional teachings is as it being part of what we call the wrong livelihoods. There are generally said to be 5 ways that we can be engaged in wrong livelihood that are primarily set out for monastics. But that doesn't mean that we as lay people in the room, should be saying, well, that doesn't apply to me then, because I don't have to worry about it, I'm not a monastic. Any of these do become, by virtue of what they're involved in, a misdeed. This is a form of lying. Deceit, being hypocritical is a form of lying, because you are causing someone to believe something that in fact is not true. That you have these qualities or are this type of practitioner or whatever, when in fact you aren't. So it says there, just as it has been said above, it is a display of good qualities one does not actually possess, due to excessive attachment to gain and honor. Gain and honor means, the physical things that we get from it, as well as honor, the good reputation, the praise, whatever that we might receive from others because others see us in that light. As in the case of pretending to be peaceful and subdued with the thought to deceive others, even though one's own mind is far from being subdued. In this vein, this book, A Discussion of the 5 Aggregates that I mentioned earlier that I read from, says, displaying the unreal to deceive others. So displaying what you know to be not factual to others, that you do not possess these qualities. Instead, you do the opposite. You say, no, again, we can see in the world at large, when people misrepresent who they are, that there are ramifications often of that. If somebody goes to a job application, or if somebody comes to them as a contractor and wants to get particular work out of them, but they say they can do it, but they can't, they never have, well then, there are going to be some price to pay in that regard. But karmically, this is not a good thing to do. It is best to be forthright, again, with others, to assure others that the way we present ourselves is in accord with our reality. The Lam Rim is the great exposition of the stages of the path. The Lam Rim Chenmo is quoted or is mentioned here. It explains deceit similarly. Deceit is specified as acting as a support for wrong livelihood, because apart from being a method to practice wrong livelihood, a pretentious attitude toward others is worthless. Wrong livelihood is of 5 types. So these are the 5 ways that we can engage in wrong livelihood, and the very first one is the one we're talking about here, pretension. And pretension is, as explained above, an external pretense towards others, feigning good qualities one does not have. Another form of wrong livelihood, and by the way, you will find these sometimes in 2 different places in the Lam Rim. One is when we talk about actually making offerings. As part of the preliminary practices, you're supposed to arrange beautiful offerings that are acquired honestly. So if you've acquired any of your offerings through any of these means, you haven't acquired them honestly. And that's kind of not a good idea to offer things, on your altar or whatever that have been acquired through dishonest means. Another way that it's presented, though, is in the Bodhisattva vows. If you have a Lam Rim that has commentary on the Bodhisattva vows, this is one of the secondary vows, is to not engage in these wrong livelihoods. So if you have taken the Bodhisattva vows, then obviously this is something you need to be very attentive to. Flattery is the second one. It's to speak smooth words in conformity with the minds of others for the sake of gain and honor. We all know what flattery is, buttering somebody up, saying all sorts of great things about them so that they will, keep resources flowing your way, Now, it doesn't mean that we don't have a good rapport with the people who or we have a business relationship with or what have you. That's an important part of it. But we should try to keep that motivation out of it, that we're just trying to make sure that we get that extra money from them, that they're going to, we just rather treat them in good terms, just as we would treat anybody in good terms, hopefully. Hinting is an interesting one. Another way that this is described in terms of a single word is insinuating, is to first flatter others and then praise their possessions out of an attachment to gain. Or sometimes it says like, to even hint, to say something like, oh, that thing that you gave me last year, that money you gave me last year was so helpful. It really, really helped me a lot. Wink, wink, You're hinting, you're kind of saying it in a way that somebody gets what you're saying, which is that you really appreciated it and you could use it again. Any of these kinds of hintings, insinuating, you've got an ulterior motive. That's another way we talk about this in our language, right? You go about doing it, but you're being underhanded. I guess you would say that it isn't a wrong livelihood to actually ask for something. If you feel so compelled, if that person is somebody who's kind and generous, to say, rather than hinting and all of this, then say, I'm really in need of money right now. Would that be something that you'd like to consider? And then the person can make their decision about whether they want to give it to you or not, rather than doing it in an underhanded way, where all of a sudden, they've been caused to do it, but you haven't been honest about it.
Saying guilt, some people are very good at guilt.
Yeah.
The hint becomes you're wrong if you don't.
Right. Yeah, Alex is pointing out the guilt factor that often gets played in there, that, it's the idea that you're sort of wrong or not being a good person if you don't, that type of thing that comes along with it sometimes. So yeah, you don't want to guilt trip other people into doing things either, that's for sure. But I think we just have to, try to be as, again, upright and honest in regard to our relationships with our whatever our means of livelihood is. Means of livelihood, I mean, you might have people who are retired, for example, and they might look at it and go, well, I don't have to worry about means of livelihood. But this would even apply in my mind to any work that you do, that even if you're not getting paid for it, it's like, to what extent, because you might be getting paid for it in terms of praise or, that type of thing. Remember that this is coming out of attachment to gain and honor or honor. So it's not just that you're getting some physical resources, a paycheck or something from that person. It's that you're getting something from them that you want to get. So if you become a volunteer in your retirement and then you're always wanting to manipulate people in this way so that they say all these nice things about you and what have you, well then that's not a good way to go about living one's life. So extortion or coercion, even like pressuring, and that's to speak about the faults of great miserliness and the like for the sake of gain, or this could even get into, I suppose, some level of threatening people, if they don't do what's good for you. I mean, and you could threaten them with the teachings on karma or something. If you aren't generous with me, if you don't give me that money, you're going to suffer in the future in your next life or something. I mean, you don't want to say those sorts of things. You don't want to be coercing people, making them. It's a bit of the guilt thing too that can be applied here. You don't want to make them feel bad if they don't comply with that way of giving you praise or gain, honor. This last one is kind of weird because it's often presented in a slightly different way in other texts, but seeking gain from gain is what it's called here, is to seek gain by praising in the presence of another what one has previously obtained, saying previously so-and-so gave me such and such. That one's a bit closer in my mind to the hinting thing. How this one is described in other texts is giving something small in the hopes of getting something greater in return. So it's almost like the way in which many places they get you to come in for like a free gift, but they want you to buy a $500 TV or something. So there's a bit of that drawing people in with something that is small with the intention of getting them to give big. And so once more, if you do have people who are kind in your life, who are involved in your welfare, it doesn't mean you don't give them anything. That's a good practice to be, but what is your intention in giving? Is your intention in giving, oh, I'm going to throw a few miserable little things at you so that you keep the giving to me? Or is it that you really want to repay in some small way their kindness? And so I think that's what we have to be really careful of, is making sure that we don't think that this means that we don't give anything to anybody else, but we have to do it with the right intention. The intention of reciprocating, giving, but not with the idea that it's a enticement to get them to give again, that it's something that is going to kind of convince them to do that. Any comments on these 5? Again, if we find that we are involved in getting our livelihood or our honor, praise, whatever, by virtue of these, then it's good to just be conscious of them, try to rectify them as much as possible. You don't have to go to extremes, but certainly just be aware that these are happening. So then it says, in brief, without guarding the stipulated boundaries of the trainings, even wandering, this sounds again like something we may not do, but certainly monks, nuns would do this. Wandering to ask for alms in a village out of attachment to gain and honor is taught to be wrong livelihood. So they would often say, that in the days of the Buddha, there would be certain times when they would be allowed to go out to seek alms, when it was mealtime, what have you, and they would receive them, and then they would put away their begging bowl and they wouldn't go back out. But if people are like, oh, I'm going to go out there and they'll see me with my robes and my begging bowl and they'll just fill it with all sorts of wonderful things, wandering around with that intention, well, then you've kind of screwed it up, because you're once more putting these types of things in play, trying to get people to in some way donate to you, give to you because of the appearance that you're giving. And it's, again, when it's done out of attachment to gain and honor. There's nothing wrong with seeking alms at the proper times and in the proper ways. Therefore, if you do not wish to be defiled by wrong livelihood, do not seek to ingratiate yourself with others, and protect without duplicity the stipulated boundaries of the Vinaya in a place of solitude. So the Vinaya, again, is referred to here because the Vinaya is the monastic code. It is the way that nuns and monks live their lives according to the stipulations that the Buddha gave, some of which are to avoid natural misdeeds, but many of them are simply stipulated or formulated misdeeds. Whereas, for lay people, those wouldn't be misdeeds. But because they've taken these vows of ordination, they would be. So the author of our text, again, Yeshe Gyaltsen, is simply giving monastics in particular a lot of encouragement to follow their vows very purely and to make sure that they aren't in any way engaging in some sort of wrong livelihood. Let's go to Geshe Rabten's presentation, which isn't quite as long as what we just went through here, because he doesn't really go that much into the 5 wrong livelihoods, but he, again, went 2 slides. Pretension is the word that was used by Stephen Batchelor in this, a mental factor that when one is overtly attached to respect and material gain, fabricates a particular excellent quality about oneself and then wishes to make it evident to others. It acts as a basis for the establishment of a mistaken livelihood and as a cause for a monk's being defeated by the fault of lying. But again, I think we'd all be defeated by if we've taken a vow not to lie, this would be a transgression. It isn't a major one unless we're professing to have great realizations by virtue of what we're saying. But nonetheless, it is a negative misdeed. Even if you haven't taken vows, it is lying. It is giving false airs. There are 2 aspects of pretension, Geshe Rabten says. Whoops, how did I hit that again? One that arises out of attachment and one that arises out of bewilderment. Bewilderment, again, is Stephen Batchelor's term for ignorance. So I don't know, I hadn't really thought about this a whole lot, but in my mind, again, these 2 are set out because obviously the main one is attachment, because it's done out of attachment to gain or honor. This is why we are doing these things of pretending to have particular qualities, putting forth that those false airs. But the ignorance part of it, the bewilderment, again, recalling that bewilderment has different levels to it. When we studied ignorance, the root delusion, obviously we're talking about the deeper ignorance at sometimes that is always at play with all of these delusions, which is the fact that we aren't seeing things correctly. We aren't seeing ourselves in terms of how we actually exist. We aren't seeing the world around us. We're not talking about that level of ignorance here because that ignorance is present in all of these. So we're talking about a grosser form of ignorance, which would be generally an ignorance of the law of cause and effect, not taking seriously the ramifications of our actions. So in that way, we can see that that's definitely at play here. But I don't know. Beyond that, it's hard for me to relate it to ignorance completely. But these two are said to be the source of this one, and the next one, dissimulation. They're the only ones that are said to come from both of these, both attachment and ignorance, I think. Isn't that correct? I don't have that sheet in front of me, but
7 and 8, yes.
yeah. So any comments from any of you in regard to that? Maybe you figured out something I haven't figured out. None of the teachers that I read commentaries have explained why they come from both attachment and ignorance. But all right, let's continue on. It's about 8 o'clock. We can get another 15 minutes or so. We've got the next one, dissimulation, that, as I said, often these two are discussed together, and there will even be a little summary of the two of them, comparing them. Dissimulation is described as the factor that commits faults due to excessive attachment to gain and honor, and is involved with attachment and ignorance. It has the function of hindering the acquisition of perfect instructions. So let's read what Yeshe Geltsen says on that. He says, just as it has been said above in that definition from Asanga, it is an awareness that wishes to hide one's faults. So what you had with deceit is that you were professing qualities you don't possess. Here you are not revealing quality or faults that you have. So in this way, again, it is a bit like concealment, but it's because of the attachment, the force of attachment to gain and honor that's involved. So you're not revealing these faults to others through the force of attachment to gain and honor. Nowadays, hiding our faults, we act smart and clever if we can get away with it. But going by the yardstick of Dharma, we have only deceived ourselves. So this is, if we don't admit to these things, kind of reveal these faults, and especially again when there's things that are at stake, when we want to make sure that people aren't getting an impression of us that is incorrect, that is not in line with reality. Doesn't mean we have to go around professing to the whole world everything that we do that's negative. I don't think that's what this means. It just means that in those situations where we have the opportunity to represent a more accurate portrayal of who we are, we happily reveal those faults. We happily admit, yeah, I really struggle with that, whatever is going on. So we can't, again, put on another different type of airs here of not even admitting to our faults. Remember that we studied this text last year when I did my Sunday teachings. I think it was last year, the Bodhisattva's Jewel Garland. I don't remember what year I did that here. There's that wonderful phrase from Lama Atisha in that text where he says, do not reveal the faults of others, only reveal your own faults. Do not hide the qualities of others, only hide your own qualities. And the idea being that we do the opposite, which is rather than professing all of our qualities and making everybody think we're so wonderful and hiding all of our faults, we want to be happy to reveal our faults and keep our qualities to ourselves. Nobody needs to know. We don't need to advertise to the whole world. And when we see qualities in others, we want to really praise them, really bring them out, really encourage that in others. When we see their faults, it doesn't mean we don't address faults at all, but we certainly don't pinpoint their faults and make them kind of stand out and bring attention to their faults. Rather, we are happy to acknowledge that they have faults, we have faults. It's just the nature of sentient beings. So anyway, this is what dissimulation is all about, is that idea of hiding our faults. So there's a quote here from Master Shantideva, chapter 5 of Engaging in the Bodhisattva Deeds, Bodhisattva Charyavatara. Let's read this together. I am constantly dwelling in the presence of all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas who are always endowed with unobscured vision. By thinking in this way, I shall likewise develop a sense of shame, respect, and fear. So, we may think that when we're having this dissimulation, when we're hiding all these faults, that there's no witnesses to that because it's only ourselves that know whether we have these faults or not. But, there are omniscient beings that know that we have these faults. I guess, that those omniscient beings don't think less of us because of that, just like we don't want to think less of others because they have faults. But nonetheless, we shouldn't be just caught up in this view that there's no ramifications to this, that it doesn't have any real bearing. It actually is going against the precepts that we're trying to follow and the advice that we're receiving from these great beings who have preceded us on this path of trying to just be as revelatory in regard to our faults as we can be. Let me go ahead and just do the discussion of the pair, and then I'll go to the slides, because even Geshe Rabten does talk about the two of these together on one slide. Since these two, deceit and dissimulation, hinder the acquisition of perfect instructions in this life, meaning that they don't allow you to perfectly follow the instructions you've been given by your gurus and so on, and produce various kinds of undesirable consequences in future lives, not meeting with great vehicles, spiritual guides, not gaining perfect instructions, and so forth. Deceit and dissimulation are enumerated among the 4 black dharmas in the questions of Kashyapa. Black dharmas, we even talk about the black dharmas and the white dharmas in regard to bodhicitta, right? Those of you who've taken the bodhisattva vows, we have this little bodhisattva vow booklet. This is a photocopy of it, but we talk there about the 4 black dharmas that we want to avoid, the negative dharmas, and the 4 positive dharmas that oppose them that we want to practice. And number 4, I'll read it from here. It says, putting on, this is the negative deed, the black deed, putting on an air of having selfless thought, but having ulterior motives other than the pure wish to attain enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings, such as pretending to be a scholar or concealing your shortcomings. So this is where it's included even nowadays in the way that the black dharmas are presented. But this is not how we practice bodhicitta even. I mean, we might think that this is only about us and our own little, minds and whether we get liberated from our afflictions or not, but it's even how we deceive others. If we are really concerned about others and their welfare, then why do we not reveal things, our faults to them? Why do we pretend to have qualities to them that are a lie? I mean, all of this should speak to the reality that if we genuinely care about others, we should be forthright and honest with them. Now, again, I'm saying this in a general way. There's always situational things where we need to be maybe modifying some of this instruction. But nonetheless, this isn't a way to practice caring for other sentient beings. It is part of going against the bodhisattva ethic. And this will keep us, as it was said in the text even, this will keep us in alignment with these teachings and with the great vehicle, with the Mahayana, with receiving teachings in the future and lives to come from great masters and what have you, by being very forthright in our dealings with others. So let's go to the slides and then we'll see if there are any questions or comments on this. Again, we'll first go through the ones on dissimulation, and then, as I said, there's one for both of them, the pair. In this text, it was called Dishonesty by Stephen Batcher. He says it's a mental factor that when one is overtly attached to respect and material gain, wishes to confuse others by keeping one's faults unknown from them. It has the function of not giving a clear response to questions and of causing an interference to obtaining properly directed service. So, the idea here is that we can create a lot of obstacles to things in our lives by virtue of this non-disclosure of our faults. Both pretension and dishonesty are similar in that they wish to convey a false image of bewilderment. So this is where he talks about the bewilderment side of it in here. Obviously, we knew that they both were coming from attachment, but still, I still kind of, I don't know if I get it completely, in terms of, I suppose if we look at it from that point of view, you're projecting this, conveying this false image of bewilderment. Somebody's asking you about something and you're just, I don't know, kind of ignorantly going forward and either saying things about yourself that are untrue or not revealing what is true in terms of your faults. But that was all that Geshe Rabten said. So any comments or questions on this? Or yeah, Amy?
I've been working on this. Certainly not enough. I need like 2 more great eons, but I've been working on it a little bit in this life, and it makes people uncomfortable. They think I'm being hard on myself or unkind to myself. I think really, especially at work, they're like, oh no, and I'm just like, no, it's just science. That's not. I don't have any miraculous anything or whatever it is. Oh, you shouldn't say that. And I'm no, I'm really not. Really not. Like, and plus I don't want to have to get stuck with that one either, because then what do I have to produce next time? But I mean, no magic. We should say no magic wands today. Sorry.
Yeah.
But they're trying to give me these very wonderful compliments, and some of it's just. I used to love it, honestly. Like part of me still kind of loves it, but I know it's not good. So,
Yeah.
So, but it's hard because oh no, don't say that about yourself. No,
I mean, I guess again we have to go back to what Amy's sharing is this idea of, again, when we receive accolades and compliments from others in our work or whatever it is that we do, that
but they're not accurate.
yeah, they're the again, we don't know the motivation of why people are saying that. That may have been their true experience, is that they felt that you were doing something really magnanimous and wonderful and what have you. But if I guess without knowing what their motivation is, which we could never know without asking them what their motivation is it our job to correct them? Is it our job to, I mean, it is our job to be honest,
They're telling me I have some ability that I don't have.
Well,
and I just go along with that. That's not.
No, and that's why I think, we have to be honest. So it comes down to the individual situation. Is it something that is really misleading them and them thinking that we have something, or is it proper? And in many cases, I think it is to simply say, well, that I can hear what you're saying to me, but in my assessment, that really isn't some ability I have. I really haven't done that, or whatever the case might be.
Don't see that about yourself.
Yeah, but I mean, if we know ourselves more honestly than other people do, which is actually often the case, not that we're always the best judge of ourselves. We always have to, kind of be very careful about how we look at ourselves. But nonetheless, we do have an awareness of our skills and abilities and qualities that is more accurate than what other people's view might be. So I think we can very skillfully correct people in that case, not to diminish the enthusiasm that they had for wanting to praise us and whatever from their side, because it's good for them to engage in that type of behavior. But nonetheless, we're not proper recipients for that. It is leading to some confusion.
I think too that you can inadvertently brag about how humble you are. Like, oh no, I'm not.
But that's yeah.
And if you just say that's very kind of you, sort of chuckle, and I think people would change the topic.
Yeah.
So you don't have to make a big discussion
Right.
about whether you're this or whether you're that, because the intention is all about what it is you are, what the perception of who you are. It's very me focused. You respond to something.
Sure.
And so that's what I've noticed sometimes. You get the spotlight off being on something else.
Right. So Alex was pointing out that in some cases, rather than playing the game of feeding into your humility and to an extreme, we even saw that in pride, right? That being overly humble can be even a form of pride. So we don't want to let it go to that extreme. But nonetheless, and you're pointing out that in some cases, just to deflect it to another topic or something and not have any dwelling on that, then that might be a technique to work with that. But I guess another side of it, though, for me is the idea, though, that if it is a situation, the way that Amy's describing it, where there might be an expectation on the basis of their assessment of what her skills were, that she's going to be able to do that in the future when she actually didn't even do it the first time, then I think that requires some, and it's, coming out of just honesty more than even humility, just making sure that somebody isn't having an unrealistic expectation of us. So I don't know. Yeah, Paula.
I think it's kind of a two-pronged thing. I think it boils down to not only intention of the nurse, what they're saying to you, but also in your quiet time, go down with yourself in your meditation time, your contemplation time, saying, is this true about me?
Sure.
And really looking at that, and seeing, is part of this true, or where's the touchstone on that?
So Paul is just pointing out for those of you online that, there's two parts of it. One might be the intention of the other person, but the other is the fact that we should investigate what we hear from others and see in our own meditation, our own reflection, whether what is being presented is true or not. Is it in accord with reality, so that we can find the touchstone between those and make sure that we're not misrepresenting ourselves either way, that we do possess something we don't, or that we don't possess something we do. Yeah, and not letting it feed our ego, for sure. Were you going to share something, Rachel? Yeah.
Oh, I
I'm
just
sorry.
was thinking, nice that you have a positive response. When I was teaching, I had a lot of expectations,
Mm,
and when I was trying to do this kind of a level of investigation of myself and continue to kind of grow, maybe working on different mental factors and so on. The society that we're in is so very limited in how it deals with these kinds of issues, right? And so if I went as a teacher and was humble or working with my own pride, it just blew up in my face, and so it's like recognizing that this kind of work that we're talking about
Sure.
in terms of investigating ourselves and being honest is not always going to match what people are willing to do. Like you said, they're not willing to hear you say something. No, they just think I'm beating up on don't beat up on yourself. And so they don't have that context. They don't see where that might be a step that you're taking. They really are.
Okay. So for those online, what Rachel was saying, if I can summarize very briefly, was that, again, the person who's saying these things to us and their expectations and where they're coming from may not necessarily coincide with what we're doing from our side and what we want to say to them, or what they may not be wanting to hear or may not be open to hearing. So it just gets complex. I mean, again,
But just also the society is really supportive of this kind of
yeah. And that society in general isn't really as supportive of this type of work that we're investigating here. So again, we do the best that we can of balancing these things and recognize that we're not going to have a perfect record when it comes down to it. And there's going to be misunderstandings and people that make wrong assessments of us, or, and just do our best to present an accurate portrayal of who we are to others. I think that these two, deceit and dissimulation, as I said, they're most relevant when it comes down to our spiritual practice, because we want to make sure that we're not giving off that kind of, it really taints the spiritual practice, because then it becomes ego minded and all it's about who we are and putting ourselves up to be or not be, or whatever the case might be. So I think we have to be very careful in that regard. There was one question from the folks at home, from Mary Mogenberg. It said, in Shantideva's verse, is shame more or less humility or saving face? I think what we're talking about here in shame, I would guess, is closer to the factor that we saw in the virtuous mental factors that we called shame. Recall that shame is this idea of self-respect. That if we look at that verse in particular, the idea was that you would always have witnesses to what's going on. So you do have some sense of then I need to be very meticulous in upholding my own view of how I want to be in the world. And that's what we mean by shame, is this self-respect that we want to make sure we live up to our own way, our own code of behavior. And then there's the other side of it, which was kind of respect for others, consideration for others. That was, we called embarrassment in this, which is not really the best English word for it. But the idea is that we also don't want to engage in misbehavior or misrepresentation of who we are, because we respect others. We're considerate of others. We're not wanting to mislead others or cause them any, dismay. So I think that's probably, what he means by shame. But it's hard for me to know for sure without looking at and even if I looked at the Tibetan, I'm not sure I'd know a whole lot from the Tibetan. Maybe people who know more Tibetan than me would be able to tell what is being translated here as shame. I'm guessing it's the same as the mental factor of shame that we saw in the virtuous group. All right, it's just after our closing time, so we have to conclude. So hold on to any questions that you might have, and when we resume in 2 weeks. Next Wednesday I'll be gone. The following Wednesday I will be back. That'll be February 13th. We will continue our study with haughtiness. Haughtiness.
We will consider our study with haughtiness.
No, we won't study with haughtiness. We will we will look at the mental factor of haughtiness. It's not such a British word, isn't it? Like haughtiness. Don't be so haughty. Anyway, I'm sorry for any people who are from Britain who are watching this. Let's let's go to page 235.
And just encouraging people that do participate with me on.
Yes,
next
please do participate. Yeah, I mean, we're doing this because it is good to have time to do more discussion and work with the material. That is actually one of the main ways that we learn. So I really do hope that people come next week for that. Let's recite the first two verses on page 235. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. Page 244, we'll dedicate for the long lives of His Holiness and Lama Zopa, but as we do this once more, think that we're dedicating for all our spiritual guides in whatever tradition, those beings who are dedicated to helping others to find the causes of peace and happiness, to be free from suffering. May we and others always have such perfect guides in our lives. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And lastly, dedicate for those that you're holding in your heart, whether they be beings that you know and are familiar with, or people in the world in general who are experiencing difficulty, hardship, harm from the elements, what have you. But those in our lives that are experiencing any obstacles or illness, who are dying or who have died, we make strong dedication for them right now. And even feel like you're sending this positive energy out to these beings, that they receive it, it becomes the cause for instantly having their suffering quelled and to ripen into all the perfect causes and conditions that they need to attain happiness and peace. And may all beings find true peace through our efforts here tonight. Okay, thank you all very much. And I will see many of you this weekend. So.